Good morning and welcome. We're delighted to be hosting this workshop on the current status of efforts to strengthen international cooperation on the decarbonization of steel and aluminum, together with climate advisors, and to have three really experienced policy experts and leaders to kick this off. I'm George Frampton. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, director of the Transatlantic Climate Policy Project there, and Matt Piotrowski, who's the Senior Director of Policy and Research at Climate Advisors, is going to be moderating today. This is public on the record. We're live streaming on Zoom, as well as on Twitter and YouTube. We encourage you to post about today's discussion and share on social media using the hashtag Atlantic Council Energy, tagging us on AC Global Energy or Climate Advisors. Those of you who are watching on Zoom can submit questions, but you have to click on the askic.org that's going to be displayed in the Zoom chat and select this event. And the same is true of people on the Atlantic Council Twitter account. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can toward the second half of the discussion. When we scheduled this program, we thought that the EU-US leaders who met this past weekend in Washington might announce some conclusion to the discussions that were kicked off 2 years ago, aimed at getting a general agreement on sustainable steel and aluminum called GASA. The idea was to resolve the controversial Trump administration tariffs on steel and aluminum that triggered a trade war with the EU and that were suspended 2 years ago for these talks, and then combine that resolution with steps to encourage more global cooperation on steel and aluminum decarbonization. But as many of you are aware, the two parties are pretty far apart on the proposed trade mechanisms, particularly since the EU has put the EU CBAM into law this month. So this weekend, the leaders just said they'll keep talking about this for the next couple of months, kicking the can down the road. And I suppose this leaves the real possibility that no GASA may actually ever emerge with both components, trade and decarbonization, in it. And these discussions won't have proved a particularly useful forum to advance cooperation on decarbonization at all. Incidentally, aluminum seems to have gotten a lot less attention in all this, but together with Climate Advisors, the Atlantic Council is publishing a paper in a few weeks focused on aluminum decarbonization and trade, which has a few interesting wrinkles relative to the steel issues. So if GASA perhaps is not going to be a productive way forward, a venue or vehicle to promote the more aligned efforts at decarbonization of steel, as some hoped, what is? And that's where we are today. So Matthew, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our speakers and get this going. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, George. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. We really appreciate your time. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's expert panel discussion. We are fortunate to be joined by Aaron Cosby, Senior Associate at International Institute for Sustainable Development, Joanna Lena, Program Lead at E3G, and Michael Mailing, the Deputy Director for the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy and Research at MIT. So we have a great panel today, so let's jump right into the conversation. The first topic we'd like to discuss is the General Agreement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, or GASA, which was initially announced by the EU and the US in 2021. As George noted in his opening remarks, the US and EU promised 2 years ago to put together an agreement on steel and aluminum that would relax, withdraw, or refashion the Trump tariffs on imports of these two commodities. The aim of this agreement has been to foster deeper international cooperation on decarbonizing these industries. But talks, as George noted, are deadlocked, and the parties are unfortunately seen to be far apart. So this past weekend, the EU and US leaders announced they would continue to work on the agreement, but they did not indicate that they've made much progress. So the opening question to the panel: what are your thoughts on the latest development between the US and the EU? And does the gas route still seem like a productive way as a policy tool for green steel and aluminum? First to Joanna.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, well, as George noted, there's sadly not much of an agreement to comment on at the moment. Obviously, in the statement from the summit, they announced substantial progress and suggest they're going to keep talking for the next 2 months. But as we all know who are watching this closely, there's been a flurry of media announcements over the last 2 weeks that suggest that definitely the two sides are still very far apart and that the negotiations are quite fractious. And it's also underlined that there's actually a divide very much on the EU side between different groups that would, on the one hand, want to really favor an approach that would go in the direction of what the US is asking for and sort of put an emphasis on the transatlantic cooperation here. And other groups who are more worried about what it could mean in terms of fidelity to open trade and global rules here. So we're definitely seeing some of the kind of divides on the EU side come through. It's not surprising we are where we are. Lots of commentators, pointed out from the start that this is an arrangement that had a lot of different objectives packed into a very tight timeline for coming to agreement on them. It was obviously made a lot of sense in some ways to tie these issues together. But it was sort of overloading the discussions with lots of different objectives where there were different possible trade-offs between agreements on these. We also know that the two sides have quite different stances on the international legal framework in which this global arrangement would sit, and that plays into how they might feel about different mechanisms and how WTO compatible they are and whether or not that really matters in certain ways. So no one expected a fully fledged agreement by the end of October, but it is disappointing that we are seeing so little progress so far, and that even though they mention substantial progress, that it really suggests that we are quite far apart and quite far away from a kind of deal at the moment. I think that also tells us a lot about the broader kind of state of the EU-US relationship at the moment. We also had, very little on the critical raw materials agreement. It generally suggests that even amongst what we would think of as the kind of closest, most like-minded partners in this space, that these types of discussions are proving really, really challenging. And sort of begs the question more broadly around what is a productive space to talk about kind of trade and climate at the international level. Is the bilateral route not possible? Is there a multilateral plurilateral option here? I just wanted to note sort of the two key elements that we at E3G as a climate change think tank have specifically been watching are very much on the kind of climate side of things and on how inclusive this arrangement is. What we found the most compelling when this was first announced is that it would be something that really brought climate and trade together in a transformative new way. This is fundamental when we're thinking about also decarbonizing the sectors in question. Steel and aluminium account together for 10% of global emissions. It's the refrain that we've all been hearing a lot the last few years. Hitting 1.5 is really about accelerating changes in these sectors, and we need trade and diplomatic policies to actually allow us to move forward on industry decarbonization at the international level. So for us, this had a lot of potential when it was first announced. It's very disappointing that the climate element of especially seems to be kind of put on the back burner, and probably even if we see some form of agreement or deal announced in January, that climate element will be kind of postponed to a later date. So it's definitely not living up to the name of having a sustainability within the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium. The other element is the global element of that title. So the inclusive dimension, which again, we thought was really strong in the initial announcement to say this is open to like-minded partners who want to engage in this. It feels like that's also very much been an afterthought, but I know that's something we'll probably come to in the discussion later on, how much you can kind of open this up to others. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Joanna. Aaron, would you want to comment on your perspective about how things may pan out going forward, and also regarding Joanna's comment at the end about the possibility, if there is agreement, about bringing in other countries into this global arrangement?
Am I allowed to just say I agree with everything Joanna said? No, excellent questions. I don't think anybody was surprised, as has already been said, that agreement was not reached. The two sides came at this from a very different starting point. But of course, we're still allowed to be disappointed. I think it is possible to come to some sort of international agreement. which involves bringing together climate and trade policy in order to try to foster decarbonization in hard to decarbonize sectors like steel, like aluminum. I don't think that's an unrealistic goal, but in this particular case, the two sides came at it from very different perspectives. The US was looking for something that it could sell on a bipartisan basis, which involved having to incorporate the other objective other than decarbonization, which is dealing with oversupply in this sector. And in effect, in order to sell this on a bipartisan basis, had to make the agreement pretty much a ring fencing China kind of an arrangement. And also, they came at it from the perspective of trying to exempt the US from the purview of the CBAM. The EU, from its perspective, came at it from the perspective of trying to eliminate the Section 232 tariffs, which the US had put in place for national security reasons that covered its aluminum and steel exports, and were willing to sign just about anything to get those off the table. Including agreeing to a negotiation which most agreed would never come to fruition in a way that both the EU and the US could accept. So they're coming at it from very different perspectives. And you know, given those starting points, I'm not sure it is realistic to think about a successful outcome, and certainly not realistic to think about an agreement which is global. This is supposed to be a global arrangement. And to be fair, unless you have an agreement which can get on board the biggest producers in the world, and that includes China, you're not really talking about a global arrangement that can help decarbonize these really important sectors like steel, which is responsible for about 8% of global emissions, aluminum responsible for about 4% of global GHG emissions. It just won't happen. If you're looking for a trade-related solution that doesn't involve the world's biggest producer, it won't happen. And so the fundamental starting point for this agreement, I think, laid the groundwork for failure. But that doesn't mean we can't get to a place which is successful at some point. I think if the parties agreed to something like a GHG intensity standard for steel and for aluminum, and we'll talk later about what kinds of standards might be applicable and viable in that context of an agreement like that, and enforce those GHG intensity standards at the border and agree to a ratcheting mechanism that would see them become more and more stringent over time. That's the kind of agreement that I think, you know, could actually deal with decarbonization. It doesn't deal with oversupply. That's a whole other kettle of fish, and the political economy of that is terrible. But I don't think an agreement is impossible.
Great, thanks, Aaron, and thanks for the positivity there. So turning to the next question for Michael, do we expect to see progress on climate-aligned trade and industrial decarbonization, perhaps at COP, at the WTO, or with the German-backed Climate Club? And if so, how?
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, George, for having me. So, you know, I feel bad following on Johanna's and Aaron's constructive and upbeat sort of outlook that, you know, we all, I think, agree that more cooperation is needed to tackle climate change and also to tackle hard to abate sectors. It would reduce costs, you know, it would reduce frictions, it would reduce legal risks, etc. But what I'm seeing from what happened last week is at the beginning of a pattern. If you look at the G7 Climate Club that was announced in 2021 and sort of has slowly and really not very impressively moved through operationalization now with the different G7 presidency in Japan. And you know, there will be some announcements, but I'm relatively reluctant to expect that it's going to be anything dramatic. Same with inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches at the OECD. What I hear from people working in that process to try to sort of even just come up with better metrics to make climate policy efforts comparable, you know, to measure what kind of extremely sensitive, a lot of political divisions, even within what you would expect are like-minded and politically aligned countries. And I think the Gaza is the best example, you know, between the EU and the US, which should be the closest allies. As Aaron said, the starting points are so different that it's extremely hard to come to some sort of agreement on something that's really robust and more than symbolic. And if I step back and see this as a pattern that may also give us a bit of predictive value on what might happen in other fora going forward, let alone the universal one of the UNFCCC with even broader membership, even broader and more varied starting points, I think what we're seeing is that we're moving from some sectors where, you know, we have had a good amount of success now in beginning to decarbonize power, now increasing transportation, and are starting to face these hard-to-abate sectors industry, which are fundamentally different politically. The political economy of the steel sector, aluminum, is very different from, say, the power sector, and how they hold policymakers captive. I think in the US in particular, if you look at Joe Biden's re-election chances, he needs to carry some of the states that have very powerful and very entrenched constituencies in these sectors. And it makes things so much more difficult. You've had the EU now working for almost 20 years now in setting up its EU ETS, the reporting rules, the compliance obligation, etc. And that sector is now used to that and wants others to follow that. The US has its own greenhouse gas reporting rule, has its own ways of measuring and sort of reporting emissions. It wants to keep to that. It cannot, due to political reasons, introduce a carbon price. These things won't change. I don't think that there's going to be a magic moment where everybody says, okay, we're willing to sort of sacrifice and abandon what we have been working on and fighting and spilling blood and sweat, politically, to agree on in our jurisdiction, to come to terms and cooperate. So I think in order to see more progress, to see actual willingness to adopt some kind of minimum common approaches, some sort of minimum common understandings on things, we probably have to step back a bit and check sort of what are the things that we're all already doing? And maybe that's a baseline that we can agree on, but there are going to be things that remain different in each jurisdiction. How to do that exactly is really, really tricky. And, I think that that's what probably the outcome of what happened last week forces us to really look at sort of how can we find ways to accommodate differences while still trying to achieve progress on some harmonized approaches. I don't have the answer to that. I think none of us really do yet. But I think we have to sort of rethink how exactly we envision cooperation in this new world of climate, trade, in industrial decarbonization, because it is showing us it's fundamentally different and more challenging.
Great. Thank you for that, Michael. And this talk about the minimal common approach is very important and very interesting. And is there a specific venue where this can be advanced? And so I'd like to get some the perspective of Joanna here, talk more about these other venues and about the possibility of seeing progress at, say, COP, the Climate Club, or at the WTO, or within like the OECD, as Michael just discussed.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I'll start with sort of going back to your question about COP28 and what we can kind of expect there. We know that we're going to get more of an announcement around the launch of the Climate Club. Michael already referred to it. This is obviously a very different kind of beast from what we would usually have referred to as a climate club in previous years or sectoral arrangements. This is effectively at the moment a fairly loose affiliation of countries who are interested in progressing, ambition on industry decarbonization without that necessarily being defined at the moment in terms of what that looks like. So it's a very open and inclusive arrangement, which is actually something we pushed for originally. We were quite worried about a kind of German or G7 branded club that would end up being fairly kind of exclusive, and the optics of that, given all of the kind of tensions that arose around the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. So yeah, what we're expecting to see at COP is effectively an announcement around the membership. We're hearing something like 27 to 29 countries at the moment, more than 50% developing countries, and the launch of a work program around kind of 3 pillars. And within those different pillars, there is a space, and there is an idea that this is a space where you can kind of resolve trade tensions, talk about interoperability between different embodied emissions and counting methodologies, between different kinds of border arrangements. But obviously there is a risk with the kind of breadth of membership and the breadth of different incentives on the table there, that it's hard to kind of come to anything that is necessarily gives you a very strong kind of incentive or stick in the context of what we would usually have expected to see within a climate club, and how that gets taken forward. I still think it's a useful venue and one to watch. It is something that has really strong political backing from the German government. It is something where members are incredibly involved. Chile is the other kind of main kind of founding member that's been driving this. You have the IEA and OECD as a kind of secretariat. So it's bringing together a lot of different, very important actors in this space into something that is new, and is a new kind of constellation of countries, also to what we were talking about before about what actually makes a kind of arrangement on industry global and who you need to have in the room on this. There are risks in terms of how substantive it can actually really progress some of these issues, and it's not a kind of trade negotiation kind of platform. But in some ways, that might give us kind of more scope and freedom and creativity actually to see some progress in some of these areas. So I do think it's one to watch, with a dose of being a bit skeptical about exactly how far it can go with this. I think Matt, you mentioned OECD others. It's really helpful to see that they are in the tent on this, basically, that there are organizations that we would usually see as kind of being a place where you go to think about coordination on technical issues, on trade issues, lots of long-standing expertise on the economics of steel trade, for example, that are being brought into exactly this process. So yeah, I'll stop there, but that would be one I definitely put on the table as one to watch.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joanna, for that. So I'd like to pivot a bit. Throughout the conversation, we've already mentioned CBAM's carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So the EU's CBAM, which is essentially a fee on carbon, on certain carbon intensive imports, is now in its initial phase. And in the US, there have been a number of competing proposals introduced on Capitol Hill. Meanwhile, some other countries are considering their own CBAMs in response to the EU phasing in its own. So my question to the group, how will the formal entry of the EU CBAM coming into effect this month have an impact on incentivizing steel and aluminum decarbonization, and what should we expect from other countries? I'd like to start with Aaron.
So that's an excellent question. As you note, there are a number of other countries that are already considering putting in place some kind of border carbon adjustment similar to the EU CBAM. So consultations on that subject have wrapped up in Canada and the UK. Australia has announced that it will be convening that similar consultation. Taiwan has actually put in place a carbon pricing scheme that it says will involve a CBAM. Brazil has a proposal in its Senate for carbon pricing, carbon emissions trading regime that may involve a CBAM. Japan, in its green growth strategy of 2020, contemplated a CBAM. The reason this is becoming so popular is that any country that takes ambitious climate action is going to be placing some kind of a price on those hard to abate industrial sectors, and in some countries those account for over 30% of national emissions. So if you do that in a highly traded sector like steel or aluminum, you risk without doing anything as an ancillary method, you risk just shifting those emissions abroad as your sectors lose market share to other countries that have no carbon pricing and therefore lower costs. So you think about a CBAM. So any country that puts in place ambitious climate action, and increasingly that's every country, is going to be thinking about something like a CBAM. But in terms of what it means for other countries, there are very few. Well, the CBAM is not actually it's an accompaniment to carbon pricing, and every country will have different underlying carbon pricing regimes. The EU has its emissions trading scheme, Canada has an output-based pricing scheme, Sweden has a carbon tax, and then therefore the CBAM or the BCA in each of those countries will look different according to how the underlying domestic scheme that it's supposed to accompany. We won't see any kind of harmonization, therefore, right? So, if we're looking for coordination, and we'll talk about standards later, it's got to be at the level of principles and best practices and that sort of thing.
So I'm sorry to cut in, Aaron, but one follow-up I have to that. If they're not what's the risk of not having these CBAMs harmonized? It's great that they are being implemented in the EU and considered in other spaces, and this can be a path forward for decarbonization of these sectors. But what's the risk of not having them harmonized?
Let me answer that, but let me back up one second and say I don't think we're going to see those kinds of mechanisms in the near future in any country other than the EU. Everybody's taking a step back, waiting to see how it plays out in the EU, waiting to see if it's challenged in the WTO, waiting to see how it's operationalized. So in the near term, we won't see a lot. In the longer term, I think we will. And the risk there is if you have those things in place in 7 different countries, and if I'm an exporter trying to export steel to all those 7 different countries, do I have to report to a different standard in every one of those 7 countries using a different methodology, using accredited verifiers that are accredited to a different protocol in every one of those 7 countries? That's a disaster scenario. That's a way to shut down global trade in commodities that are needed for the green economy of the future. It's highly immiserated. And the whole point of the WTO is to try to lower those kinds of trade frictions, transaction costs, restrictions that impede the free flow of trade that are the basis for global prosperity. So that's the disaster scenario. That's why it's important to harmonize. One thing. The other thing is, if you don't have any kind of a harmonized approach, you leave open a great amount of scope at the domestic level to make these things not just an instrument of environmental protection, but an instrument of sort of unfair protection of domestic producers. That is, if you don't have some agreement on the basic principles by which these things operate, you leave open the possibility that national economic interests, vested interests, will shape the unfolding of those regimes at the national level in such a way that they are really unfair to producers in other countries.
Great. Thank you for that, Aaron. Michael, I'd like to get any follow-ups from you on what Aaron said, and particularly regarding the viability of moving toward like a standard that would be applicable for steel and other commodities.
So in your question, Matt, before to Aaron, you asked, what's the impact going to be of the CBAM on decarbonization of, among other things, steel and aluminum? Now, the CBAM is already having an effect in 2 ways. The first one is, of course, any producers that export to the EU, that export CBAM-covered goods, want to try and reduce the carbon footprint of those goods that they sell into the EU. That's the first, if you like, the first order incentive. By having a carbon price applied to those imports into the EU, you send a signal to decarbonize in order for those products to be more competitive. Same thing that EU producers face under the EU ETS. But there's a second order, if you like, incentive, which has been, I think, underestimated. And at least before the CBAM really kicks into full effect in the definitive period after the transitional period with a payment obligation, is the one that's probably going to have more impact. And that's the signal it sends to foreign countries around the world, trade partners of the EU, to implement policies that could reduce the compliance obligation under the CBAM and help those foreign companies, the companies in their jurisdictions, to comply. So that's, for one, it could be things like MRV legislation or regulations that help them sort of build up and come to speed on how to measure or quantify their emissions and report them in standardized formats, which then will make it easier for them to comply with the reporting obligations under the CBAM. But more importantly, it's also really unleashed an avalanche, and it's phenomenal. I mean, I and Aaron and others, we've traveled around the world or talked with decision makers, both in the private and public sector, in countries from Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Turkey, Morocco, Brazil, Mexico. And in all these countries, that the CBAM is mentioned as one of the reasons why long-standing debates about whether or not to introduce a carbon price, how to design it, when to have it, etc., have suddenly kicked in and accelerated with surprisingly often a timeline of 2026. By then, we need to have a mandatory carbon pricing system in place, because that's when the CBAM will take effect with payment obligations, and such domestic carbon prices would be credited. There's still, I think, a lot of misunderstandings in what exactly will count and how much credit they actually will get. I think a lot of foreign jurisdictions and also companies are expecting that will kind of absolve them entirely from the CBAM, which is of course not the case. They'll only get credit, so they still probably have quite a significant residual obligation. But nonetheless, that effect has been phenomenal. And there is something such as a first mover advantage in a sense. So the Brussels effect of the EU moving first is prompting other countries to look very closely to the EU carbon pricing approach, but also to the approaches in the monitoring and reporting regulation and the accreditation and verification regulations, in how to, for instance, quantify, estimate their emissions and report them. That will have some implications, I think, also for the chances of cooperation. The thing is, what I mentioned in my earlier answer is, all these things take a lot of effort and investment to set up. There's administrative infrastructure within companies. You have to set management structures. You have to train people. They have to learn, the methodologies and procedures to report emissions. That kind of does create some path dependency. And that's why I concur with Aaron that we're not going to see harmonization on this front of border carbon adjustments. The border carbon adjustment reflects or in some way extends domestic policies. These are deeply entrenched. There's deep path dependencies, a lot of politics, a lot of stakeholder politics in play as well. And so it doesn't make it easy to kind of say, okay, we're going to change or, open up our rules in order to allow for something that's common. That said, all the reporting rules have a common legacy. IPCC rules all the way back from 1996, and then ISO standards, GHG protocol, etc. You find some common elements in all these different reporting standards. So I do see some chance for harmonization going forward. And that's why I argued, what are sort of the common, the joint or minimum common elements that you find across the board? And maybe we can find some kind of concessions or some kind of flexibility. The EU in its implementing regulation on reporting of emissions in the transitional period, for instance, does allow for importers to report using any kind of standard for a transition, for a flexible transition period in the first several months. Maybe something like that could be extended into the future in order to allow for slightly different approaches, as long as they meet certain minimum harmonized, common requirements or standards. Now, there was another part of your question, Matt, I didn't answer, but I've spoken enough, so maybe we launch it back into the discussion. Sorry.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Michael. I'd like to turn to Joanna and get your thoughts on how the transition phase is going for the EU in integrating its CBAM in the current phase.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting in that, I guess, pilot phase has kicked off, but obviously this is just a period where we're looking at importers kind of figuring out what that means in terms of the data they need to submit, what kind of measurement they're going to go for. Are they going to also, refer back to kind of average emissions intensity at country level, where we're still waiting for kind of updates from the Commission on what that looks like. So it is both a start, but without it really feeling like a big bang kind of start. It is going to sort of peter out in terms of exactly what this looks like and the impact on importers and how that then knocks on to other countries. Something that we've always followed quite closely beyond kind of what's happening domestically in the EU is also, what's happening internationally. Michael and Aaron have already shared, the number of countries who are thinking about their own types of measures here. We follow very closely kind of UNFCCC negotiations, and it has been interesting to see this year and potentially and quite worrying actually how CBAM and broader feelings around trade tensions have kind of spilled into UNFCCC negotiations. So we've seen lots of countries include references to unilateral trade measures, to carbon border adjustment mechanism, to the US IRA, explicitly in their submissions to the global stock take. It's not clear at the moment how much this is kind of a real concern and how much it's in negotiating stance. Again, countries are probably both submitting that, but also considering their own measures they can take, to what kind of Michael and Aaron were discussing. So it's one where we are definitely seeing heightened tensions around this, but it's a question of how much countries are kind of going two paths of saying this is a concern for them. They worry about the precedent being set here by these types of measures, and then themselves considering what this could mean for them domestically. To go back to what we were talking about though before about what it means for these countries to all kind of implement their own versions of CBAM or ETS, I am interested, and this is almost a question to kind of Michael and Aaron as well in terms of the discussions they've been having with different countries. To some extent, we've often said this is kind of CBAM in action. The EU in a way wanted to kind of externalize carbon pricing, implicitly make that something that happens in other countries in this process. I do wonder whether that's a success, in indefinite terms. Obviously, to what Michael said previously, you've got lots of different political economies in different countries. It's not clear that carbon pricing will be appropriate everywhere. It has to evolve and develop in different ways. I wonder to what extent in certain places a kind of shortcut to some kind of carbon pricing scheme to just kind of match or, relate to the EU CBAM, how effective that will be in terms of driving industrial decarbonization in that country, for example. It's just a challenge and a question to both of you in terms of how you're seeing this play out in practice. And I suppose the thing I'm thinking about here in particular is that obviously within the EU, the ETS has developed over a long time. It hasn't always been effective. It is the tool that we have. Again, it's what we're kind of wedded and married to at the moment, but it hasn't come without its troubles. So kind of selling it as a scheme that is necessarily going to work elsewhere or something to kind of take lessons from is just something I'm slightly wary of.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Joanna. I'd like to pivot a bit here. We've focused mostly on G7 countries, but now I want to discuss the issue of the need to bring developing countries into the conversation. I'd like to get your views on how we bring the two biggest steel producers and key players, China and India, into this effort to facilitate global decarbonization of sectors such as steel. Current discussions are either unilateral within the EU, bilateral, the gas negotiations between the EU and US, and then G7 and OECD bloc governments. I'll put this to Aaron first.
That's the key question, because as I said before, if we have an agreement, even between the US and the EU, we're not dealing with the majority of global production in these commodities, and we're not dealing with the majority of global GHG emissions in these commodities. So we will have failed on both grounds. But let me back up and go beyond just China and India as producers, and to the broader question of the kinds of trade and climate measures that Joanna is talking about that have put the cat in the hen house of UNFCCC negotiations. And if we don't find some way to reconcile the really necessary ambition on industrial decarbonization in pioneering jurisdictions like the EU and the US with the needs for development of other countries around the world, including China and India, but not exclusively them, then we have failed. We have failed both on the grounds of environment, because we haven't solved the climate crisis, and we've failed on the grounds of development. We haven't solved the development crisis. And I think you start by saying, yes, we are in a climate crisis, so you can't, the solution to that tension can't be to slack off in our ambition in jurisdictions like the EU and the US. But you need to also say there's no place for unfairly favoring domestic production over foreign production. So the design of your measures is extremely important. But once you've said that, the impacts of those measures on other countries is really no different than the impacts of other kinds of standards. Every country has standards for efficiency of automobiles, for example, the GHG efficiency of appliances like air conditioners and washing machines. And they demand that foreign producers change their productive technology to meet those standards. There's no real difference other than, in this case, we're talking about standards which will achieve a positive spillover for everybody. Greenhouse gas reduction is good for everybody. But it's not just a climate crisis. We have a development crisis. We have billions of people around the world that don't even have access to grid electricity, and they're living on less than $2 a day below the poverty line. If we don't solve that problem, then the rest of it doesn't matter. If we don't solve the climate and the development crisis together, we will have failed on both grounds. So we need, Joanna's right, a carbon price doesn't actually deal with the problem by itself. It's very important, but carbon pricing in and of itself doesn't deal with the problem. What you need over and above a carbon price is some kind of proactive efforts to disseminate the new technologies, to de-risk and boost the finance that can underwrite the investment in those technologies, to do capacity building in those countries and companies that need it to come up to speed on the new technologies. And that's not just that's not the CBAM itself doesn't do that. The GASA itself won't do that. You need international efforts to try to boost the capacity of all producers in the steel and aluminum sectors to decarbonize. In some countries, that's more difficult than in other countries. And it goes beyond the kinds of trade arrangements we're talking about to something more like international development assistance and capacity building and cooperation in a sense that we're not seeing at the moment. But that's where we need to go. If you want, to come back to actually answer your question, if you want to bring India and China on board, you have to have an agreement that looks a little more like that kind of an agreement and a little less like an agreement that's designed to ring fence the economic interests and serve geopolitical interests of the states.
Great. Thanks, Aaron, for all those really important points. Michael, I'd like to turn to you, get your thoughts on how we can increase coordination with developing countries, particularly in the areas of global decarbonization, but also help in other efforts too. How can we balance helping them solve the climate crisis while also helping them grow their economies?
Mm-hmm. So to sort of segue from Aaron's response, which was, I think, a very eloquent attempt to encapsulate this incredibly thorny dilemma that we face. If we look at the failed Gaza, what we sort of now conceded disappointing defeat on in the last week now, you could argue that in some ways, maybe for the climate, that actually would have been a step backwards. Maybe I'm being provocative, maybe I'm an outlier in that, but it was very clearly driven by also geoeconomic, domestic stakeholder constituency driven politics to help assist or strengthen the competitiveness of domestic producers vis-a-vis a large producer, the largest by far, more than half of global steel coming out of China, that operates with unfair practices, no question about that, and to reverse some of the unintended and undesirable effects of decades of globalization, but at the expense of literally ring fencing, as Aaron just said, and locking out the largest producer of clean technology, the largest emitter, and that would come at a cost. That would make it much, much harder, I think, also to cooperate, inevitably necessary to cooperate on decarbonization and other fora like the UNFCCC. We also don't know so there's so many balls in play. We want to de-risk, we want to diversify supply chains, we want to reshore, or onshore manufacturing capacities that have wandered away. There are the political things, upcoming elections. How do we make sure that we keep the progressive or the climate sort of progressive administrations in place going forward and sustain the acceptability of green transitions and so on? There's so much in play. But let's also not forget that we have benefited greatly from the very cheap technologies that we're importing from those same countries as the result of decades of leveraging the comparative advantage of producers to scale up and produce at very low cost, and just sort of shifting that very quickly overnight, more or less. So in a period of just a few years now, will have a lot of consequences and increased costs and incurred delays that may be a step backwards on decarbonization globally, not to mention the need to cooperate and to make sure that we're all on board with achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So to your question, Matt, how do we sort of square this, or how do we cross these sort of goals that are really in tension or in friction with each other, to on the one hand make sure that we achieve some of the legitimate objectives, to allow for our domestic producers to move fast with our very ambitious green transitions or green deals in Europe, also in North America increasingly so, to deal with some of the risks of having supply chains concentrated too much in countries, and also manufacturing capacity in countries where there are issues with transparency, with intervention in markets, with support dumping, et cetera, no question about that. And yet at the same time make sure that we can still cooperate. This with large emerging economies, middle income countries like China and India, of course, big players, Brazil, but even more importantly, probably with all the developing countries that are yet several stages behind China, India, et cetera, in their own economic development, yet where a lot of the future emissions growth will lie. For me, I think there's clearly one answer that we've already alluded to that has to be leveraged more. There's a tremendous trust deficit now between the developing and the developed world in international climate cooperation, from the failure to live up to commitments on climate finance, also in capacity building and technology transfer. I think we have to really sort of rise up to that, however difficult it may be. We have to rise up to that. That will take smart tools. Aaron mentioned, it can't all just be public finance, taxpayer-funded climate finance. There will have to be new mechanisms to de-risk investments by private sector in developing countries. It has to be more cooperation on capacity building. I think that the model of energy transition partnerships, or just energy transition partnerships, that we've seen popping up for just a handful of countries, South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, among others, is a good one to follow. Can we scale that up to all other developing countries, though? Is a good question. Probably not. It's a tremendous challenge. That's why I really wanted to start out saying, Aaron really tried to sort of portray how big this challenge is. Really, really difficult, I think, to bridge all these different objectives that we have that many times are just not, aligned with each other and will compete with each other. There's a lot of work to do, and COP28 will be the next arena where we can try and advance this.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That's all very well put. I want to throw it to Joanna to follow up and talk about how best we can overcome this trust gap between developing and developed countries, and how that can help move forward in industrial decarbonization and growing like a climate aligned trade.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I think there are two elements I wanted to add to the great comments that Aaron and Michael made already. And one is on the why we should be doing this, and one is on the how. On the why, we've already talked about kind of from a global fairness perspective, from a climate perspective, vast majority of emissions intensive capacity additions are going to be happening not in Europe or the US. This is, the climate game is outside of these countries. But the element I really wanted to add is actually about the fact that I think we can make a really strong case for why this is also beneficial for kind of domestic industries and for the transition in the US and the EU, amongst other countries. I think Michael already noted, we're thinking about critical raw materials, our access to those, how we kind of ensure that we continue to have this with countries who obviously justifiably want a piece of that transition pie. I think another element that we're watching very closely is how decarbonization and the transition in these sectors can actually really substantively change supply chains as they've operated previously. If you're talking about very different inputs, whether it's really focusing on where you get your renewable energy from, the kind of other, whether, like we said, critical raw materials, it actually creates a very different dynamic around where you might want to situate the industries of the future. And it might actually require really different partnerships with trade partners on some of this. So I know that, for example, in Europe, and particularly in Germany, there's a thought about, okay, well, we've got a lot of emissions intensive production domestically, but we aren't renewables rich and we don't have all the materials we need. So what does it mean to think about how we import parts of these commodities? And if we're going to import hydrogen, say, maybe we're going to input green iron, and maybe that requires a very different kind of relationship with the trade partner, and probably it requires more actual tech transfer and capacity building, and et cetera, in terms of what that actual bilateral relationship looks like. So I think, again, there's something quite interesting in terms of rethinking what the supply chains of the future look like, how different parts of these supply chains could be located in different places, and how that reshapes actually who wins and gains from this. There's a positive story also to be told from a jobs perspective. Actually, a lot of, for example, in the steel supply chain, most of the kind of labor is actually within the value chain on producing cars and etc. So you can outsource parts of your supply chain in Europe without losing as many of the jobs in practice. So I think there's a good story we can tell here about how this is also beneficial to domestic industries, making it a less emissions intensive and resource intensive transition in the US and Europe as well. And then on the question of how we actually make this fairer and how we kind of create a package that works for developing countries here. Both Aaron and Michael have mentioned, obviously, transition finance is a crucial piece. Access to technology is another crucial piece. The other element I would really note here is actually access to green product markets. So when we've been talking about trade measures to date, we've been talking about closing access to markets on the basis of carbon intensive production, but how can we actually open access to markets on the basis of cleaner production? And here I don't just mean accounting for relative carbon prices, but I actually mean the procurement schemes we're setting up, where we're saying, oh, we're going to procure green steel, green concrete, etc. How do you make that something that's actually accessible to third countries as well? What kind of offtake agreements can we come up with between countries that are saying, okay, we're able to actually produce this because we have a lot of renewables and we have the iron, etc., etc. So what does it look like for this US automaker or this European automaker to kind of have an arrangement here? I think we need to think creatively there. I know it's a challenging one politically as well, because domestically, I mean, we've seen this with the US IRA, there is a reason for having procurement targeted at domestic producers, but this is another piece that we can kind of add for making it make sense from a developing country perspective. And maybe the final point on this, I would say that the really crucial element here is that all of these pieces don't have to just exist in one measure. We don't have to have this be the complete package that exists within a EU CBAM or in a GASLA arrangement that we're probably not going to get, or within a climate club. I think it's about piecing together the parts of these elements, making sure we've got that transition finance offer and that technology access offer and that procurement offer, and that they somehow piece together in a way that makes it all work from the perspective of developing countries, while they're also living up to these kind of higher standards being set by the EU CBAM, etc. I think that's the only way we're going to get a kind of coherent package, rather than expecting it to kind of be able to be delivered within just one kind of trade measure.
Great, thank you. And thanks for highlighting all those challenges and opportunities. So we have now about 10 minutes left. I'd like to get to a couple questions from good questions from the audience, so that kind of bring together a lot of the different topics and themes that we've discussed today. So the first question is, if trade is a critical element of industrial decarbonization, what would it take to succeed? Is it advocacy? Is it some kind of campaign? And how could philanthropy help? Then any of you want to tackle that first?
Let me expand it to say trade policy and trade law, and then my answer flows from what Joanna was just talking about. It's a nice segue. The idea that one way in which trade policy can help is keeping open borders to the products of transformed industry in these sectors when they are produced. And let me give you a sort of a negative example of how that doesn't work out sometimes in practice. Let's hypothetically say that China has now started producing very, very cheap, very, very good electric vehicles. And let's say hypothetically that the wide dissemination of those vehicles is critical to decarbonizing transport worldwide, which is a huge part of global emissions. Then we could say it would be a really good thing if borders were open to the export from China of those sorts of vehicles. We are currently seeing, though, and that's all true, we're currently seeing moves both in the US and the EU to shut out Chinese production, ostensibly on the basis of the fact that it was subsidized, which may be true, but really on the basis of the fact that it will destroy US and European manufacturing prosperity in those sectors. So it's critically important to understand that in the kinds of reorganizations of production that Joanna talked about, if green steel starts being produced not in the EU, but in Australia and Saudi Arabia, where you got lots of solar energy and iron ore, and similarly aluminum, that we don't then shut down the export of those green goods from those countries because of economic reasons. And this is one thing trade rules are supposed to be there for. They're supposed to be there to ensure that there's free competition in those kinds of goods. If we can ensure that competition isn't shutting down green production, we will have gone a long way toward helping or toward finding a role for trade in industrial decarbonization. Not easy, because it's an extremely fraught domestic challenge to say, yeah, okay, we are going to allow our now uncompetitive industries, once we've considered carbon costs, to wither away in the face of foreign competition from folks that are better at producing green goods than we are. Not easy, but this is one role for trade policy. Can we agree on what subsidies are legitimate and needed in the course of this kind of industrial or global energy and transportation transformation? Can we agree on what kinds of barriers are legitimate and which are not? Can we agree on whether local content regulations are legitimate or not in furthering? So all of these elements of trade policy and law should come to play in helping us keep the borders open to investment and flow of green goods. A bit of a challenge, but that's where I see trade policy and law coming into play.
Great, thanks for that, Aaron. Do Joanna or Michael, any thoughts on this particular question?
I'm happy to, but Joanna.
Yep, go ahead, Michael. Yeah.
Should I go ahead?
That's great, Michael.
All right, thank you. So, I think we have to get used to the fact we are in the architecture or in a world defined in term by the Paris Agreement and its sort of nationally determined, very heterogeneous approach. Countries determine this themselves, what they can do, what they're able to do in line with domestic circumstances. So we'll be moving at very different speeds for a long time. Eventually, hopefully, we converge on climate neutrality sometime in the second half of the century. But in the interim, we'll be moving in different speeds, at different speeds. And I think the use of trade-related climate measures is going to expand. And we're seeing already with the CBAM how powerful, how it can define and shape agendas around the world and just get attention and prompt other jurisdictions and private actors in those jurisdictions to adjust their policies and also their production processes and patterns and strategies, et cetera, to these. We'll probably see more of that. But what we don't yet fully understand, I think, is all the sort of consequences, how it all shakes out. And I think Aaron just already mentioned, there are, by erecting barriers, setting up more conditions for access to markets, et cetera, we are fragmenting the global economy. That will raise costs that can have unintended effects. There's also, again, there's always compromises involved. there is some pandering to domestic constituencies. There are protectionist elements. There's a risk of slippery slopes that we slide down and make them more about protectionism than about policy, about environmental policy, about climate objectives. So if I were in philanthropy, I would think, as hard as it may be to kind of get harmonized approaches and to agree on something common, where I'm still very pessimistic, and I think the outcome last week is just another example of how difficult that is. I still think the dialogue and discussion and debate is more important than ever, and sort of making sure that there is more engagement across these same jurisdictions that are erecting barriers to ensure that one avoids some of the really unintended consequences and tries to mitigate at least some of the negative outcomes that are being, essentially accepted as a price for erecting these barriers to achieve other objectives, I think is really important. So supporting more dialogue, more debate across borders with developing countries, with major producers, I think is critical. And that's something I think philanthropies can help with.
Great. Thank you for that, Michael. I like your point about that expanding trade-related climate policies will be taking off in the coming years, and philanthropy and advocacy definitely can play a pivotal role in this. Joanna, I'd like to get your thoughts on this question, and I think that this will probably be our final word because we're almost out of time.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, just to sort of, I guess, add two pieces to what's already been said. I think in terms of an issue area where I think it would be really useful to have more capacity and I guess philanthropy focused, the question that we addressed just before about developing countries and how that package emerges, whether it's how do we ensure that there's that transition finance pipeline, what does it mean to kind of build capacity in multilateral development banks and have kind of campaigning and nudging on multilateral development banks to do more on industry decarbonization. I think that's a very rich place for philanthropy to actually be very effective in kind of creating more space on that front. And then I guess coming up from the kind of specific area within the kind of trade and industry space, I would say that there's still a lot of kind of community bridging that's required, to Michael's point of bringing countries together, but also I'd say even within the expert communities, obviously we have a group of people who really think about trade and industry in a lot of detail, but I think there are still a huge amount, there's a lot of trade expertise and from an economic perspective, from a legal perspective, that could be brought to bear on this, where we still don't quite understand the implications of some of the trade arrangements that could be that could be emerging over the coming years. So something around bringing those communities closer together around scenario analysis and really trying to understand how this plays out in a geopolitical sense, I think could be really useful. And then doing that in conjunction with whether it's track 2 or track 1.5 dialogues, where you actually bring government stakeholders into a kind of closed meeting where you can explore those scenarios and really think through the implications with decision makers, I think could be quite a powerful piece for sort of understanding and unpacking some of those implications.
Wow, thank you so much, Joanna. All great points from the panelists. But unfortunately, we're out of time. This was a really, really great discussion. Thank you to our panelists and our audience for joining us today. I would like to thank my colleagues at Climate Advisors and at the Atlantic Council for their support in organizing today's program. And I would like to thank Maya Sparkman, Lizzie Bowen, Maya Edwards, and Iman Coughlin for all their help. And we really appreciate everybody's time today. I hope you have a great rest of today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.